black ink using a fine liner is a great way to draw, but it does present some particular drawing challenges for some scenes, and particularly nature scenes where there is just so much detail. Let me use this drawing I've done recently to illustrate 10 techniques that I've used in my ink drawing approach to, I hope, create a reasonably realistic effect. The first technique, and I think this is one of the most important techniques that I've been working on recently, the last of these techniques that I've actually begun to consciously use, and that's what I call visual disruption. Now, by visual disruption, I mean that things we see are interrupted by other things. So particularly things in front. And a great time to use these is when I do these very spiky, quite large spinifex looking bushes. And if you look, these very fine, long, very long, they might even be up to 1 meter long, needle-like branches, or leaves, I suppose they are, leaves, come out in a mass of pointiness. And it's very hard to draw them without just drawing lots of lines. But we try and draw the effect of the detail. And what happens is, where they come in front of other things, it's important that we allow some sort of interruption of what's behind. So I've interrupted the value, the dark hatching, and I've also interrupted here on the edge the, if you like, the outline, the marks I've used to indicate where that tree trunk is. And the same thing happens down here. It also happens between these pointy needles that are closer in regards to the ones that are behind. And so I've tried to indicate that some are in front of others by interrupting, seeing what's behind. And it would be very tempting just to draw these over the top of what's behind because they are so thin. But what we lose then is the sense that these are actually just about the closest thing to us in this scene. The second one we've really touched on in context of the last one, and that's to be very careful not to rush to outline, not to draw outline. And by outline, I mean a continuous, fairly even line, the way we'd see in a cartoon. Because if we do rush to outline, we may end up with a cartoon-looking effect for that reason. Instead, if you look at these trees, which really are quite large objects, and it would have been easy to think, oh, a line down here will do. Look to see what I've used. I've got some heavier lines, a gap, a lighter line, a gap, a little curved mark. I've got some curved lines that, because they break with a slight gap in between, they create a much more interesting profile. On this side, I've got a very light line, a heavy line, a gap, who knows what that is, a dot, and then I've got a branch coming out of this fork. Even down here, where it's fairly dark and fairly heavily drawn, I haven't got a heavy outline. I have established a continuous outline, probably from here to here, but not by doing so much a heavy line as the hatching that comes up to it, that I've connected quite carefully, more slowly than a lot of the hatching in this drawing, to get a nice, precise, hardish edge, but without a heavy black line. When we look at this tree that's further away than this tree, it's even more a series of light, small marks that approximately join up into the tree shape. This creates a softer effect, which then helps me as I use other things to try and create a sense of 3 dimensions. The third point, and for nature scenes, this is particularly with branches, notice, well, you can't see the actual demo, although there is a video. I'll link the demo of this drawing as the end screen, and there you'll see what I do. But I actually draw these branches from the top down. It's really hard drawing from here up to really have enough control to create the branches that we want, that go in the direction that we want, that have the thickness that we want. When we go from the top down, we have a lot more control, and that, I find, creates far more successful branches. But because we know branches grow from the bottom up and they're connected to the trunk, and we often start with the trunk, then we feel like we just continue them. But it's actually not, in my experience, a very satisfactory way. Better control, better placement, and better evenness going from the top down. And even with these small ones here, these ones I go from the top down, and these very fine branches, I go from the top down. The fourth technique is when it comes to trees, using hatching for form, using hatching to show the shape of what's underneath. And with this tree here, you can see that I could have done vertical hatching and that would have been quicker. And I did use it for various reasons for this small tree that's further back. But I've done far more time-consuming horizontal hatching. But that lets me curve these lines slightly to indicate the curvature of this tree as it rises above eye level. And it's the same on this closer tree. I'm able to go slightly rounded, getting more rounded as we go up. At some point at eye level, these lines can become quite straight, and then as they go below eye level, they can start to curve again, and that introduces the sense of perspective that we get in a nature scene. Perspective is not just for architecture. Perspective is everywhere, and if we can indicate it strongly in this sort of way, it really adds a sense of realism, I think. The fifth point is still on hatching, but it's hatching for edges rather than three-dimensionality. And I find in nature it's particularly useful when it comes to rocks. Now, this is a path going through the bush, so these are rocks that people walk on constantly, and so the edges are rounded. Now, have a good look at what I've done. I've got a variety of marks, of hatching marks, a few little dots, and the thing is they don't line up in a straight line because I'm trying to create the sense of a soft edge, and a soft edge will give the sense, the feeling of roundedness. And sometimes I can also use the direction of the hatching to indicate a slope on the rock. And if you look over at this rock here, I've done that far more. These lines all follow the form of the rock underneath. When we hatch, consider what is the underlying form and how can I accentuate that. The sixth one is values, lights and darks. So again, it flows from hatching because as well as suggesting form, we're creating darkness. And so there's a few things I can do with darkness. One is I can highlight the main subject. Often it's in the center or it's closer, but not necessarily. And this tree here is the main subject. And so by just going a little bit darker, I've allowed for that. But notice I've created lots of variation in my darkness. Even down here, some parts of the tree are darker than other parts. And that's because that's how it looks in light. Light bounces around and creates unevenness. And because this is not dead straight, because this trunk in parts comes towards us, in other parts moves away from us, it also captures the light differently. So creating variation in these sorts of things is very helpful in making them look real, but also it gives us a chance to highlight the main things. And also it lets us manipulate a sense of depth because darker things will come forward in the plane. So this little cluster of ferns down here certainly feels closer than what's over here or over here because of the extra darkness. The seventh one, and gosh, there are so many places here I can illustrate this, is to not try and draw the actual detail, but to create the effect of the detail. The detail is overwhelming. If we start to draw it, we'll never know when to stop and we'll probably just give up being overwhelmed. So what I want to do is to find marks that don't capture how the tiny little parts of something looks, how they actually are, but how the overall object attracts our attention, attracts the light, holds the light, creates edges. That's very important, and we do it quite differently whether something's close or far away. If we look at this little plant here, I wanted to suggest that we can see the leaves, but I wanted to be very careful that I didn't start drawing individual precise leaves because that would have looked out of place with everything else. And yet I wanted to create the sense, the feel, the effect that this is both close enough and large enough that we can see the detail. And I needed to do just a few little bits more clearly. And then over here, we have a sense that this is the same as that. These are all the ways we think, and just to go back to look at this long, talk about visual disruption through here. And I've left, very carefully, I've left that gap where this long needle palm frond, fern frond thing interrupts our view of the tree. And it illustrates the next point beautifully, which is be aware of negative space. Now, negative space is where we actually don't draw the object, but we draw what's behind it. So it's usually a darker valued background that creates negative space. I've done it here as well with this fern here. You can see how I've actually highlighted by colouring in the dark, not colouring in, but by hatching the darkness behind the fern, I've actually created the silhouette of a couple of the leaves in more detail. It's what I've done here as well. I haven't drawn the spiky things so much as the darker areas, the shadows behind, which highlight those, and far more effective. Negative space, we draw the things behind. Even with this rock here, not quite so much negative space, but it's the hatching behind that highlights this edge. And this actually brings me on to the 9th point, which is what I call adjacent contrast. It's manipulating very carefully where you have light and dark next to each other. And it's to try and maximize the places where we do have light and dark next to each other, such as here and here, and to minimize the places where we have a lot of, if you like, gray that's all the same next to each other. Because where we have a lot of gray next to each other, it's harder to see what's going on. The greater contrast lets us read what's happening, what we're looking at, far more easily. One way we can do this is when we have our reference, is to deliberately manipulate what we're looking at, manipulate the marks and how we, and particularly the hatching, to not end up with, say, two dark places next to each other. So it would have been easy to have made this a bit darker, but then this bit here wouldn't have stood out so much. This would have merged with that, and that would have made it hard to see either. If we look over here, we can see that some of these branches are being indicated by darkness on each side, but in other parts, there's actually darkness on the branch. So sometimes we see the light part on the branches through negative space, and sometimes we see shadow on the branches. We see the positive space. So it's jumping from negative to positive and back again can be very effective when we have tree canopies with filtered light coming onto them. And the final technique, and this in some ways is the simplest and the hardest of all, is to preserve white paper. When we have a scene that's as complex and as busy as this photo is, one that actually has no white in it at all, it's easy to get over-enthused putting marks on the paper, and every bit of white paper becomes an opportunity to put marks there to hopefully improve our drawing, improve what we're going to have at the end. But it can be very difficult to know when to stop. At the start, we have this pressure to fill everything. But at some point, we have filled so much that we actually have to go slowly and work out, where do I need to make sure I don't put any more marks unless I absolutely have to. That's a different place in every drawing, but we need to learn to have that moment when we've maybe even progressed just halfway through and think, okay, where are the, if you like, the lightest parts that I want to have at the end? And I need to go really carefully. It's very easy to just go, once we get in the rhythm of putting marks everywhere, and just slowly fill in all the gaps, because these whites help us to navigate what we have drawn. They give breathing space, as well as creating visual breathing space, as well as creating actual objects such as these rocks. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I really like this little drawing. It always turns out that sometimes we prefer some of our results than others, and I think this is a nice little scene that comes together quite well. So it's been fun to look at the different mark making techniques I've used, that I've drawn on to create this scene. These 10 techniques, I think of these as tools in my toolbox, in my drawing toolbox, and I get to use whichever ones I think are helpful to create the piece of work I want to have at the end. The techniques don't tell me what to do. I can't just use them because I know them. I have to have a bigger picture, a bigger understanding of the drawing process and what I'm trying to do. But if I have that, then that guides me into which tools to use in which part of the scene to get the best result. All the best using these 10 ink drawing techniques with your nature scenes, or quite frankly, any scene you want to draw. I'll see you next time. Bye.